Well, good evening and welcome everybody to the last of our summer talks. During the past year, we've all relied on technology to keep us from total boredom and in touch with culture and the outside world. And we're hopeful that our next talk on September the 25th will actually be live with real people, real tea, real sandwiches. But of course, we can't guarantee it, so it's still fingers crossed. Now, as usual, this talk is being recorded, so please, can you all put yourselves on mute and stop your videos while the talk is on? But please remember to put yourselves back on video and to unmute yourselves when the talk is over, because it's really nice to see everybody. And if you've got questions, they can go into the chat box, or you can wave your hand and hopefully I will see you. Now, during the last 18 months, we've all been really aware of advances in medicine, never more so than we've got the vaccine, which has helped us through the pandemic. So it's appropriate that our subject this evening is medicine and doctors. The Austen family was not unfamiliar with illness and doctors and medicine. Jane Austen, as you will all know, had an illness which has not been totally verified even today, which would have been curable today. Mrs. Austen was seriously ill while she was here in Bath, and Edward Austen came to Bath in 1799 to consult and take the waters. Now, our speaker tonight, Dr. Hilary Aiken, is a consultant anaesthetist and an expert on all things medical. She comes from the west of Scotland. She's a long-standing interest in the Austen, and she's a life member of the Jane Austen Society. She's also on the committee of the Scottish branch and has given them a lot of talks. And she's something of a historian. I'm not sure whether she wants me to say this, but because she's a historian and is searching out different subjects to talk about, gives her an excuse to reread all of Austen's novels. But I'm quite sure she doesn't need an excuse to read all Austen's novels again. Anyway, we're absolutely delighted that she's given up her time to come and talk to us this evening. So please, will you welcome your speaker tonight, Dr. Hilary Aiken.
Well, thank you for the introduction, Diana. Let me just see, what am I doing? Yeah, good. Yes, thank you for that kind introduction, Diana. I'd very much like to thank the branch for the invitation to speak today. I'm sure we'd all much rather be meeting in person, and I'd certainly love to be revisiting the beautiful city of Bath, but at least Zoom allows me to speak to you from my home here in the west of Scotland, without all the tedious travel that's involved. And my topic this evening, as Diana has said, is medical men in Jane Austen. Oh, I have a problem here with advancing my slides, which were working beautifully before. Let me just try something. Sorry about this, folks. Oh, there we go. Something's happened. Good. Quite a few medical men, and they are all men, turn up in Jane Austen's writing. And there's mention of medics in all of the mature novels and also in her letters, because of course she came across real medics in addition to the fictional ones she created. So who were all these people? What sort of work would they undertake? And what sort of training and qualifications would they hold? In this talk, I'm having trouble with my slides. Hang on. I'm so sorry about this. In this talk, I'm going to give an overview of the medical men we come across in Jane Austen's fiction, and then some background relating to training, income, and social standing. We'll look at some important events in the development of modern medicine around Jane Austen's time. And finally, we'll have a look at some of the real medics involved with Jane Austen and her family. Up until I retired a couple of years ago, Diana said I was an anaesthetist. I'm not an active anaesthetist anymore. I retired a few years ago, and I was a doctor. And in the 21st century in the United Kingdom, I was a doctor because the General Medical Council said I was. And they're the body for ensuring I had obtained a recognised medical degree and recognised postgraduate qualifications. And you can look me up or anyone else claiming to be a doctor in this country on a publicly available register to check. However, the body that became the General Medical Council was only established in 1858, long after Jane Austen's time. So how did people know who was treating them and whether they were quacks? Well, the answer is generally they didn't, although, as we'll see, local reputation and word of mouth, to a greater degree than we see today, would be some sort of guarantee. Firstly, something for you all to think about. Mr. Perry from Emma is Jane Austen's most famous medical creation, and he's certainly the one we hear the most about. What do we think of Mr. Perry? So there's A, he's a charlatan taking a rich and credulous patient for all he can get, or B, he's a conscientious and attentive professional doing the best he can with limited useful treatments. Now, if we were in the room, I'd be asking for a show of hands at this point, but since we're on Zoom, let's not. But just hold that thought and have a little think to yourself about Mr. Perry, and we'll come back to him later. I'm now going to give you a rundown of episodes requiring medical attention on and off stage in the novels. In Sense and Sensibility, the first published, there's a major medical incident towards the end. Marianne Dashwood becomes seriously ill following a chill, and it's overlaid on a period of self-neglect following a broken heart. They're staying with the Palmers, whose apothecary is Mr. Harris. He visits daily and prescribes cordials, but he makes no secret that it's a worrying situation. One night, with Marianne deteriorating, he's sent for at midnight and arrives at 5 a.m, so waiting ages for the doctor is not a new thing. At one stage, Eleanor suggests a second opinion. However, fortunately, Marianne begins to improve. The other medical episode in Sense and Sensibility is earlier, when the sisters are staying in London with Mrs. Jennings. Mr. Donovan, the apothecary, is called to see Charlotte's newborn baby about a trivial ailment. But he's not so much an apothecary as a plot device, because he brings news of Lucy and Edward's secret engagement. When he arrives to see the baby, he's just attended Fanny Dashwood, who's having hysterics, having just found out about it, and he's now standing by for the mother being told, with a somewhat gleeful aspect, I think. He tells Mrs. Jennings and Charlotte all about it, and they're a pair of absolute blabbermouths, so he might as well be putting a notice in the Times. Jane Austen sometimes uses a medical man to advance the plot in this way. With a wide range of visits in the community, they often pass on information, sometimes of the sort that would raise eyebrows today. In Pride and Prejudice, Jane Bennet becomes ill while a dinner guest at the house of Mr. Bingley. Her scheming mother had refused her the carriage because rain was expected, and she felt it would be useful if something was to detain Jane for a few days at the house of the local eligible bachelor. She gets thoroughly soaked and becomes unwell. Mr. Jones, the apothecary, visits, diagnoses a cold, prescribes some draughts, and he advises bed rest and staying put, so exactly the advice Mrs. Bennet's been seeking. Mansfield Park has no named medical characters, and although Fanny never seems to be very robust, everybody keeps well, although in my opinion, there's probably something wrong with Lady Bertram. Off stage, Tom Bertram becomes seriously ill after a sustained drinking bout at the races, and another chill, and he's attended by unnamed physicians. In Emma, we meet the pinnacle of Jane Austen's medical men, Mr. Perry. He's a really interesting literary construct because we don't actually meet Mr. Perry in person very often, and he's one of Jane Austen's characters who has very little direct speech, but many opinions are ascribed to him. Words are put into his mouth, mainly by Mr. Woodhouse, who quotes Mr. Perry as his gospel. He visits Mr. Woodhouse very frequently, as we see here, often apparently just for a little chat, but as we'll see later, I suspect Mr. Woodhouse likes his tonics and cordials, and many medicines are supplied during these little chats. Mr. Perry is also not very good at patient confidentiality, and on a couple of occasions he discusses his patients with their neighbours. And then there's the business of Mr. Perry's carriage. Frank Churchill lets slip his knowledge of the plan and has to backtrack furiously when he realises he got the information in his illicit correspondence with Jane Fairfax. So there we see the medic being used as a plot device again. Mr. Perry's documented workload includes a nasty cold and sore throat, a middle-aged man who's bilious, childhood measles, and a young woman with loss of appetite, headaches and nervous debility. Not an unfamiliar workload to many present-day GPs, I would suspect. The final two completed novels were published together after Jane Austen's death. In Northanger Abbey, there are no onstage medical dramas, although Mrs. Tilney was attended by unnamed physicians during her final illness some years before. In Persuasion, my favourite, there are a couple of medical dramas, and it's accident and emergency time. Firstly, Anne's young nephew falls from a tree and sustains a dislocated collarbone and a back injury. He's treated by Mr. Robinson, the apothecary, and I'll come back to this later. And then later in the novel, Louisa falls from the cob at Lyme, sustaining a significant head injury, and a surgeon is sent for. Sanditon, Jane Austen's final fragment, is a send-up of illness and hypochondria. There are no medical men in person, but a number of characters are rude about the whole medical tribe. And reading it again, it struck me as an interesting thing to be written by a woman who by that time must have known she was ill, and who had probably had quite a bit of medical advice around that time. And finally, there's Dr. Davis, Nancy Steele's beau in Sense and Sensibility. Lazy reader that I am, I've always assumed he was a medical doctor, and only in my reading for this talk did I spot the reference to accuracy for Dr. Davis. He's a doctor of divinity and not a medical doctor at all. I'm sure many of you reread Jane Austen frequently, and you get something out of it every single time. Most of the medical men we meet in the novels are apothecaries. However, Jane Austen also mentions surgeons and physicians, and therefore includes the three main strands of recognised medics in the late 18th, early 19th century. So who's who? An apothecary was a trained and partly regulated professional who learned by apprenticeship. Apothecaries split away from the company of grocers in 1615, forming the Worshipful Society of Apothecaries, which exists to this day. You might think it strange that apothecaries are originally descended from grocers, but remember, most early medicines derived from herbs and spices, and who had this knowledge? The grocers. Apothecaries originally merely ran a shop and dispensed prescriptions issued by physicians, but naturally over time became knowledgeable about the conditions they were dispensing for, much as a pharmacist can give you a good deal of useful advice today. And being cheaper than consulting a physician, for those lower down the social spectrum, they were usually the primary source of medical advice and care. In rural areas, physicians were a bit thin on the ground, so consulting the apothecary would be the first port of call, even for the wealthy. By Jane Austen's time, and as seen in many of her novels, they were making house calls and diagnosing and dispensing advice, as well as making up medicines, with a work pattern recognisably that of an old-fashioned country GP. So these two pictures show you the two roles of the apothecary. In the top picture, there he is in his shop, he's making up the medicines, and the gentleman at the counter is a little alarmed to see the figure of death behind the curtain mixing up the medicines, not entirely unrealistic in those days. And the bottom image, there we have the apothecary in his shop with his lovely jars in the background, but he's having a look in this lady's mouth to see if he can work out what's going on. Physicians had a university degree and were usually members of the College of Physicians in London, which was founded in 1518. In Scotland, we have our own colleges. So the picture top right, this one here, is the current Royal College of Physicians in London. It's just on the edge of Regent's Park, and it's either an architectural marvel or a complete monstrosity, depending on your view of these matters. Bottom left, that is the College of Physicians in London in Jane Austen's time. It's in Warwick Lane near St Paul's Cathedral. And bottom right, I have to be patriotic and include that's the Royal College of Physicians in Edinburgh. Lovely building, lots of marble columns and gold leaf, etc. It should be noted that physicians' degrees at that time were nothing like the comprehensive medical courses that we know of today. They studied subjects like physic and materia medica and didn't necessarily have much clinical exposure. The first medical school that we would recognise was set up in Edinburgh in 1736, followed by Glasgow in 1744. The English universities didn't see the need for some years, so hence Scottish doctors gained a good reputation, which I would maintain we still have to this day. Members of the London College had a monopoly on medical advice within 7 miles of London, where most of them were to be found, and they had the right to supervise surgeons and apothecaries. By 1783, there were 337 physicians in provincial towns in England, often clustered in places like Bath. Very few of them were members of the London College. They didn't see the point, and there was no compulsion to be so. It should also be noted that not all physicians had attended university, because at that time degrees could be bought. Edward Jenner, of smallpox vaccination fame, whom we think of as an eminent doctor, was a country apothecary who bought a degree from St Andrews University, which was known to sell degrees with not too many questions asked. Physicians' roles were in history and observation. They generally didn't touch the patient, back to the GP practice of the present day during the pandemic. Seeing actual GPs seemed to be a problem. Physicians would make a diagnosis, they would offer advice and write a prescription, which the apothecary would dispense. Physicians were top of the tree, and it's notable that in Jane Austen's fiction, physicians are mentioned in connection with characters at the higher end of the social scale, or those with pretensions. I've already mentioned that Mrs. Tilney, the wife of a general who lives in an abbey, was attended by physicians. When Jane is taken ill in Pride and Prejudice and is forced to stay at the Bingleys, she's attended by Mr. Jones, the apothecary, as I've already mentioned. However, Mr. Bingley's ghastly snobby sisters are not happy with country advice and suggest sending to town for an eminent physician for a cold in a fit young woman, remember. And in Mansfield Park, the wealthy heir Tom Bertram is attended by physicians. Anything hands-on was the province of surgeons. Originally descended from barbers due to their dexterity with sharp implements, the surgeons broke away and in 1745 formed the Honourable Company of Surgeons, a city livery company, which became the Royal College of Surgeons of London in 1800. Again, we have our own versions. The top one is the College of Surgeons in Lincoln's Inn Fields in London. It's always been on that site, but it was bombed during the war, so it's a 1950s building. Still gives me chills as I sat one of my postgraduate exams there. And the bottom one is Surgeons' Hall, which is the old College of Surgeons in Edinburgh. It's now part of the university. Once again, few provincial surgeons were members of the company, as they felt it was unrelated to their work or status. Surgeons also learned by apprenticeship and were viewed as skilled tradesmen. The Navy had its own surgeons, and we spot one in Mansfield Park. At Portsmouth, we briefly meet Mr. Campbell, a friend of William Price. He's a ship's surgeon, and he's described as a well-behaved young man. I wish I could say that about every surgeon I'd ever worked with. When we think of 18th century surgery, we tend to think of gruesome amputations like this, and Fanny Burney's horrific account of her mastectomy in 1811. Anaesthesia, my own specialty, was not successfully demonstrated until 1846. However, major procedures like this were rare, and due to the high mortality, really had to be avoided at all costs. The chips absolutely had to be down to embark on something like this. Most surgical practice involved much more minor work, often not involving an operation at all. We also now automatically think of surgeons working exclusively in hospitals, and although some of them held hospital appointments as part of their practice, most of them worked in the community. Leg ulcers, interestingly, formed a huge part of practice. Due to poor nutrition, and particularly scurvy, these were much more common in Jane Austen's time, and surgeons were skilled at dressings and management of leg ulcers, probably more so than their present-day counterparts. Other work included abscesses, Accidents, including those involving horses, and you may remember that Jane Austen's friend, Mrs. Lefroy, died following a fall from a horse. They did bone setting, dental work, bleeding, vaccinations, very in vogue just now, and surgeons also had a profitable monopoly on the treatment of venereal disease. Around this time, surgeons were extending into midwifery. Having a man midwife in attendance became rather fashionable, but might have had a sound reason. Obstetric forceps were starting to become relatively commonly known about, and surgeons had the monopoly on anything involving instruments. Well-to-do mothers were starting to realise that a man midwife might just be able to save them or their baby in the way that a traditional midwife might not. And I love this slide because it's actually still reflective of current obstetric practice. In my hospital, we had a midwife-led unit and it was all lovely carpets. We didn't quite have a nice fire in the grate. And is that a scented candle maybe on the mantelpiece? Whereas the male doctors have the bare floorboards and the scary instruments and the drugs. So still relatively true to this day. So these three, physicians, surgeons and apothecaries, were what the medical historian Irving Loudon, among others, has dubbed the tripartite model of medical care. It's important to note that by Jane Austen's time, the boundaries were becoming extremely blurred. The apothecaries, as noted, were diagnosing, invading the physician's turf, and a significant number of them also had some surgical experience as part of their training. A very common practitioner of the time was the surgeon/apothecary. In a survey of English counties in 1783, 82% of practitioners described themselves thus. In other words, they were starting to develop into a skilled generalist, and the term general practitioner was first used in 1809. Below these three recognised groups were large numbers of irregular practitioners who had no training and who flourished among poor and rural populations. Some of these people would be adequate, having picked up expertise as they went along, but many would be dangerous and incompetent. Some of these people were around for much longer than you might think. When I gave this talk to a medical society, a retired obstetrician told me that when he was training in Aberdeen, so when he was a boy, his seniors told tales of the careful negotiations that used to have to go on with the local unqualified midwife, because the fisherwives very much preferred her services to that of the hospital. And it was really only the introduction of the NHS in 1948, when everything became free, that did away with most of these people altogether. Exaggerated claims could be made about the efficacy of treatments, the derivation of the word quack. You quack about how marvellous it all is. Many advertising leaflets of the time, like this one, made fictitious claims about royalty or other prominent persons. I don't know if you see 2 lines down there, it says that Dr. Maclachlan is by His Majesty's authority, and I do rather think His Majesty might not have known too much about Dr. Maclachlan. Without regulation, you could call yourself anything you liked, and many people did. For instance, calling themselves physicians when there were no such thing. And there was also widespread public confusion about terminology, perhaps in the way that some of you are not sure which modern day doctors are Mr. or more commonly now Mrs. and which were Doctor. Now we know she's perfect in every way, but I think Jane Austen gets it slightly wrong in Persuasion. You remember that little Charles Musgrove falls from a tree, dislocates his collarbone and sustains a back injury. Mr. Robinson is sent for and he's described as an apothecary. Now, if you've been paying attention, you'll know that bone setting is a surgical duty. So have I identified a second Jane Austen error? Well, perhaps Mr. Robinson is a surgeon/apothecary, and Jane Austen's contemporaneous readers would have known this without having it spelled out. Interesting to note that of the 3 major groups at the time, the surgeons were the most useful, and as an anaesthetist, it kind of pains me to say this. The only drugs available to physicians and apothecaries, which we would still regard as useful at all, were laudanum, a strong concoction of opioids, quinine, digitalis, from which modern day digoxin is derived, and salicylate, from which aspirin is derived. All other medications were at worst ineffective, at best ineffective rather, and at worst downright dangerous. For instance, mercury was a popular treatment. However, if you could get your abscess lanced, your bone set or your dodgy tooth pulled. Without an anaesthetic, it would be very unpleasant, but it would almost certainly make you better. I want to move on now to some important dates in the reform of medicine round about Jane Austen's time. The first significant date is well before Jane Austen's time, but it's important as it shaped the way we see practice being conducted in the novels. In 1704, what is known as the Rose case went back and forward and all the way to the House of Lords. The practice of the apothecary visiting, diagnosing and treating patients was widespread, although technically this was illegal. By statute, they were restricted to making up a physician's prescription. Mr. Rose was a London apothecary, and a disgruntled patient complained when he was charged for advice. This went through the various levels of the law, but the Lord's judgment finally went in favour of the apothecaries on the grounds that the practice was widespread and it would deny healthcare to a huge section of the population. Technically, it didn't reverse existing law, but it gave apothecaries some degree of protection for their custom and practice. Most apothecaries from that stage, however, billed for medicines and journeys, but not for advice. Jane Austen alludes to this when Miss Bates tells Emma Mr. Perry would not charge anything for attendance on her niece if she was ill. I do wonder if this is a little joke at Miss Bates' expense that we no longer recognise. Jane Austen's contemporaneous readers would have known that Mr. Perry shouldn't be charging anyone for advice. The next date we need to consider is 1815, towards the end of Jane Austen's life, when the Apothecaries Act became law. For the first time, apothecaries needed to sit an examination and be granted a licence to practice by the Society of Apothecaries. To be eligible for the examination, applicants needed to be at least 20 years of age, to have served at least 5 years as an apprentice, plus 6 months to a year in hospital, and to supply testimonials. Fortunately for everybody, the legislation was not retrospective, so those already in practice were not required to gain the licence. 173 candidates gained the licence in the first year, and in the second year, 1816, one of the successful candidates was John Keats the poet. This was the first time there had been any attempt to regulate the training and check the credentials of any medical care provider. The LSA remained a recognised postgraduate qualification for GPs until 2003, and many older GPs will have LSA among their qualifications. And finally, some years after Jane Austen's death, the first Medical Act of 1858 established the Medical Council, defined what was and was not a recognised medical qualification, and established a register of qualified doctors. There had been 15 previous unsuccessful bills brought before Parliament, and there's a whole other talk about the bitter years of turf wars between the different branches of the profession as everybody fought for position and recognition. Since most of the characters we meet in Jane Austen were apothecaries, I want to go into them in some more detail. They generally served a 7-year apprenticeship, and an apprentice was essential for a busy apothecary. While he was out on his rounds, he needed someone to be back at the shop, making and dispensing medicines. Some apprentices were just used as drudges, but most would accompany the master on his rounds and perhaps later on treat some patients themselves. There's a sighting of an apprentice in Pride and Prejudice. When Jane has been ill at Netherfield and attended by Mr. Jones, Aunt Phillips, who always knows what's going on, finds out from Mr. Jones's shop boy that no more drafts are being sent to Netherfield, which allows her to know that Jane has come home. The poor shop boy is almost certainly an apprentice, so it is in effect a medical student that Aunt Phillips is being a bit snooty about. Successful apothecaries might have more than one apprentice. The most junior would be the shop boy, and the more senior ones would get the patient experience. We don't see any apprentices visiting anyone in Jane Austen, so presumably the better off patients saw the boss. Apothecaries came from a wide variety of backgrounds. Most had some sort of school education up till about 14 or 15, when they would start the apprenticeship. As might be anticipated, a huge number were the sons and nephews of apothecaries. Medicine was always a family business. There were many advantages. The apprenticeship premium would be a token amount, and the apprentice would be a known quantity and a ready-made successor to the business. Around this time, it was starting to be viewed as a respectable employment and a way to rise. A survey from Bristol, the very area you're based in this evening, from the period shows the fathers of apothecaries are drawn mainly from the ranks of the more respectable professions. As well as medics, there are clergy, barristers, army and navy officers, and even some landed gentlemen. There's also a smattering of merchants of various types who've done well enough to invest in their sons' future. In the latter half of the 18th century, after finishing your apprenticeship, it was becoming common to spend some time in a hospital, attending lectures and walking the wards. There was no syllabus and it wasn't compulsory before 1815, so it was all a bit haphazard and more difficult for rural apprentices, so they tended to go straight into practice until the Apothecaries Act of 1815 made it compulsory. I'm now going to enter a very delicate area. You'll remember in Emma the great debate between Mr. Woodhouse and his daughter Isabella about the relative merits of his Mr. Perry and her Mr. Wingfield, which threatened to turn a bit nasty. Well, Mr. Perry is a country apothecary and Mr. Wingfield is a London apothecary, so it's likely that around this time Mr. Wingfield would have hospital experience and Mr. Perry not. Just saying. Apothecaries' income was extremely variable, and an average country income of £400 per annum has been suggested, while in the city, incomes were much higher and could be in excess of £1,000. Payment in kind would be common in the rural economy. For instance, you treat the farmer, he gives you a load of hay for your horse. Mr. Poulsford of Wells recorded in his diary sitting down with the blacksmith and a bottle of wine at the year end, working out how much they owed each other and settling the difference, which sounds very civilised to me. In terms of charges for individual treatments, a journey or visit around the end of the 18th century would cost 3 to 5 shillings, and a draft was around £0.50 to 3 shillings. Charges tended to be remarkably consistent, and there's no evidence that wealthy patients would be charged more. In 1775, a surgeon was paid 15 6 for a journey and setting a collarbone, just the treatment required for little Charles Musgrove. We think polypharmacy and overprescribing are modern phenomena, but the Georgians loved their medicines, which is why I think Mr. Perry would be a fan of anything I think Mr. Woodhouse would be a fan of anything Mr. Perry cared to prescribe. In 1755, a little before Jane Austen's time, the annual apothecary bill for the Carew family in Somerset was in excess of £150, with 687 itemised medications listed, delivered almost every day. There's no suggestion of any serious illness or chronic disease in this family. Many such bills exist, and this is not out of the ordinary. I have always wondered what the etiquette would be when Marianne Dashwood was taken ill at the Palmers. The Dashwood girls are not wealthy, but the evidence seems to suggest that well-to-do families received an annual bill, so I'm assuming the Palmers would foot the bill for their guest. Back to Mr. Perry. I've already mentioned the plot development when Frank Churchill blunders by mentioning Mr. Perry's carriage. In the Cambridge Companion to Jane Austen, Edward Copeland's chapter on money includes a table of the lifestyle different incomes would support and suggests an income of £700 to £1,000 would be required for a carriage. So Mr. Perry's doing rather well for himself. However, the carriage is actually Mrs. Perry's idea, and it's an impractical one for a country apothecary. In the country, when it was dark, it was really dark, the roads were terrible and the apothecary might be exhausted having been up all night. The risk of a carriage running off the road or overturning would be high. Most country apothecaries would rather rely on a good, safe horse with plenty of stamina, and there's evidence that much care was taken of the horse on whom the livelihood depended. There are accounts of the horse arriving home with its exhausted master asleep on its back, and if I may switch author and period for a second, there's an account of just such an episode in Thomas Hardy's The Woodlanders. Carriages would be more common in towns, and a practitioner with many wealthy patients would have a carriage to arrive in style and demonstrate the trappings of success. Patients had choice in their practitioner, so patronage would be important. If the inhabitants of Highbury see that Mr. Perry is good enough for the big house, they'll assume he's the best and use him also. We don't hear of there being another apothecary in Highbury, but around this period there was an oversupply of medical men, so there may well be opposition. The social standing of apothecaries was changing at the end of the 18th century, and they were beginning to be viewed as skilled professionals, but there's no getting away from the fact that they ran a shop and were in trade. Everybody in Highbury speaks well of Mr. Perry. He's described as intelligent and gentlemanlike, but he's not at the Coles dinner party. Jane Austen's own social standing is a little lower than that of many of her characters, and in her letters she describes an occasion when Mr. Lyford, the Steventon apothecary, arrives to visit her mother at dinner time and is invited to sit down and join the family meal. However, some years later, when advising her niece Anna, the aspiring author, about a book she's writing, and Aunt Jane is picking up the points she doesn't think work, she says, "A country surgeon would not be introduced to men of their rank." This brings me on to the real medical men around Jane Austen, and her newsy, gossipy letters to Cassandra mainly are full of medical matters relating to friends and family. Do the middle-class, hard-working Austens have any medics among their number? They seem like the sort of family who ought to, but there are none in the immediate family for whom the clergy and the navy seem to suffice. Jane Austen's paternal grandfather, William Austen, was a surgeon in Tunbridge, but died when George Austen was around 5 years old, who thereafter was brought up by an uncle. Tyso Saul Hancock, who married Jane Austen's aunt Philadelphia, was nominally employed as a surgeon by the East India Company, but was more interested in trading, and we know little about the medical activities of either of these gentlemen. Those of you who are members of the main Jane Austen Society may remember this image on the cover of the annual report a year or two ago. It's a Reynolds portrait, for many years thought to be of Clive of India and his family, but work by Charlotte Mitchell has recently postulated that this is in fact the Hancock family. Now, if that's correct, and it is disputed, that would make the lady on the right, that's Aunt Philadelphia, the little girl is cousin Eliza, and we even know the name of the maid. She's called Clorinda, and she came back from India with the family and remained in England for several years afterwards. Pardon me. Medicine tended to run in families, as it still does, and Mr. Lyford, who stayed for dinner, was a member of a medical dynasty. We first come across him in 1798. Jane is 22, and the family are living at Steventon in Hampshire. Mrs. Austen has been knocked up by a journey home from Kent. Mr. Lyford comes and prescribes laudanum, which allows her to sleep for 8 hours. Since it contains morphine, heroin, codeine, among other things, no wonder. Another Mr. Lyford pops up in 1808, when Jane is living with Cassandra and their mother in Southampton. He treats Jane's ears with almond oil to great effect on her hearing, presumably for earwax, the old remedies being the best. And finally, there's the Mr. Lyford, who treated Jane Austen during her final illness in Winchester. Deirdre Le Fay identified the Steventon Lyford as John Lyford, a surgeon in Basingstoke. His daughter Mary was a friend of Jane Austen, although she manages her relief at managing to avoid his son, also John, at a ball. The Winchester Lyford is Giles King Lyford, a surgeon ordinary at Winchester County Hospital, the nephew of John Sr. And the Southampton Lyford is thought to be Charles Lyford, an apothecary in Southampton, possibly the brother of Giles. Edward Knight, Jane Austen's wealthy brother, goes to Bath for his health in 1799. Jane is of the party, and her letters home mention numerous doctors and their various pros and cons. It surely was customer choice in medicine at that time, and Bath was full of doctors. Of a Dr. Mapleton, she comments, "There is not a physician in the place who writes so many prescriptions as he does, and I'm not sure whether this was a compliment or not." And as you see, Jane Austen was also acquainted with his family. I love this. This is classic Jane, isn't it? I do not see the Miss Mapletons very often, but just as often as I like. We are always glad to meet, and I do not wish to wear out our satisfaction. I'm now going to embark in one of those little diversions that make reading around Jane Austen such fun. Many of you will know that Jane Austen spent a couple of short periods at school as a child, and bear with me, you'll see why we're off on this tangent in a minute. The second of these educational outings was to the boarding school at the Abbey Gateway, Reading, run by Madame Latournelle, who was actually Esther Hackett and about as French as you or me. Being thought to be French presumably added to the tone of the place for the parents of prospective pupils. Madame Latournelle, or Mrs. Hackett, was the aunt of the self-same David Mapleton, later encountered by Jane Austen in Bath. He's an interesting illustration of the fluidity of medical careers at that time. He was the son of a grocer, and his mother was the original proprietress of the school. The Mapleton parents did well enough to pay £100 for young David to be apprenticed as an apothecary surgeon in London, and he subsequently ran a successful practice in Henley-on-Thames. In 1785, in his 30s, he gained an MD by attestation from Marischal College, Aberdeen, like Edward Jenner did at St Andrews. I was a bit hard on Dr Jenner, as it seems to have been a common and reasonably respectable way to gain an MD in those times. Marischal College awarded MDs from 1700, but didn't actually give any lectures on the subject until 1823. Attestation meant you found 2 or 3 existing physicians prepared to say you were competent, experienced, and generally a jolly good chap. There's some suggestion that Marischal required submission of a thesis, but it appears not to have been compulsory, and there's no record of Mr Mapleton submitting a thesis. His sponsors were Doctors Fordyce and Lane from Henley in Oxfordshire, which indicates he was sponsored by 2 of his local colleagues. By the time Jane Austen encounters him, he's a successful and wealthy physician in Bath. His family home was in the Circus, and a family friend of the Lee Perrots, Jane's Bath relatives. He's a perfect example of the power of a medical career to allow a rise from fairly humble origins. Lady Bridges, Edward's mother-in-law, winters in Bath as befits a wealthy widow in her 60s, just as Lady Russell does in Persuasion. Lady Bridges was there in 1813 and 1814, being treated by Dr Parry, Jane mentions gout, who on both occasions advises Lady Bridges staying all winter. As Jane comments, I suppose he will not mind having a few more of her ladyship's guineas. Jane Austen's father died in Bath. The illness seems to have been quite short, and he was being attended by Mr Bowen, the apothecary, who treated him successfully on a previous occasion for similar symptoms. However, as he deteriorated, a physician was called at Mr Bowen's request, and Dr Gibbs attended, but sadly by then, Mr Austen was a lost cause and died shortly afterwards. This escalation in care, when available, seems to be a regular occurrence. When Jane's Aunt Philadelphia Hancock, the lady that would be in the portrait, is dying of breast cancer, over several months she's attended initially by a doctress, Lord knows what qualifications of any she had, followed by a surgeon, Mr Roops, and finally a physician, who prescribed laudanum, which at least relieved the excruciating pain she'd been suffering, all to no avail, of course. There are too many doctors to mention in Jane Austen's letters. We'll be here all night if I go through them all, but I do want to say something about the attendants during Jane's final illness. The first mention of Jane Austen's own illness was in a letter to Cassandra in September 1816, when she was 40. She's been complaining of back pain and had clearly been suffering when Cassandra had left for Cheltenham a few days earlier. She writes that her back has been much better, and Dr White means to call before he leaves the country. This is John White, a surgeon who practiced in Hampshire, who was the nephew of Gilbert White of Selborne, the nature writer. Jane clearly remained unwell over the following winter, with mention of fatigue, not being able to get out much, feverishness, she thinks it's related to bile, but always minimising her symptoms and putting on a brave front. There's no specific mention of any attendance by medics over the winter, but in April 1817, she mentions having seen Mr Curtis. William Curtis was an Alton apothecary and a member of a prominent family of Alton Quakers. and another medical dynasty, and this is his portrait. In a letter in May 1817, she gives her friend Anne Sharp fuller details of the seriousness of the symptoms and how unwell she's been, although, once again, she puts on a brave front and claims she's much better. She mentions the Alton apothecary has run out of ideas and suggested better advice. So again, we see that escalation in care when necessary. Jane Austen is grateful that good advice is close at hand from the hospital in Winchester, whence one of the surgeons had previously attended her with good effect. She writes, "The consequence is that instead of going to town to put myself in the hands of some physician, as I should otherwise have done, I am going to Winchester instead for some weeks to see what Mr. Lyford can do." So there's clearly been some idea of Jane's going to London to receive medical care, but in a change of plan, she chose Winchester instead, and one of the Lyfords, a medical family known to her for many years. In her next couple of letters from Winchester at the end of May, she remains positive, as does Mr. Lyford, but we know how this ends. These were her last two known letters, after which she falls silent, and she died there on July the 18th, 204 years ago this week. Cassandra later wrote that Mr. Lyford attended during her last hours and attended something which gave her ease. Many of you will be familiar with this building. This is the house she died in. The limitations of early 19th century medicine are all too clear. There were no investigations, nobody really knows what the diagnosis was, and no effective treatments, apart from that final application, which was probably laudanum, and the only useful thing to be done at that point. So we mustn't be too hard on Mr. Perry. He was of his time. He didn't have any effective treatments to offer, but remember, his knowledge of his patients, acquired over many years, and his time were useful tools in his armoury, sadly all too frequently unavailable today. So I hope I've given you a better understanding of who all these people mentioned in Jane Austen are. When you go looking for them, there's quite a few of them. So I hope the next time you're reading your Jane Austen, you'll give Mr. Donovan, Mr. Robinson or Mr. Harris a little nod and appreciate who they are. Thank you. I'll stop screen sharing now. There we go. I hope. Oh.
Right. Thank you very, very much, Hilary. That was absolutely lovely. Really interesting. So many things that one wouldn't think about. You've really sort of brought it to life. Now, I'm sure there will be a few questions. I've certainly got one or two. So can everybody please put themselves back on video? I've got a lot of people here. Unmute yourselves. Oh, good. Yes, I can see Marion. Diana, Terry, hello. Nancy, Michael, Joan Reynolds, hello, Joan. Robert. Hello. I can see Duncan Brown's hand. I can't see anything else. Celia, somebody called Jane who hasn't unmuted herself. Siobhan, I think I've got, oh, there's Betty. Hello, Betty. Mark. Hello, Mark. Gary. Richard. A lot of you still haven't put yourselves on video. I still can't see you. Anyway, first up, who's got a question?
There's one in the chat.
There's one in the chat, right? Let me have a look.
Mr. iPad has asked.
Mr. iPad. Oh, here we go. Is there any retrospective diagnosis of Jane's illness?
Well, if you're asking me what I think she died of, the short and boring answer is I don't know. Obviously, there's the famous diagnosis of Addison's disease by Zachary Cope. Now, that was a BMJ paper in 1964. And I've always thought it was a bit of a dodgy diagnosis. Addison's gives you brown pigmentation, and he's very much hung up on this black and white and all wrong colours in the face. I went and read that paper actually while I was researching this talk, and nowadays we're interested in evidence-based medicine. So if you make an assertion, what's the evidence for it? What's your proof? And there's very little. More recently, a retired physician who lives in Chawton, I believe, called Michael Sanders, has suggested a diagnosis of systemic lupus erythematosus, which is an autoimmune disease. Now, both of the, and he makes a better case for it, I have to say, and that's his field of expertise, so I give ground. Both of these diseases are pretty rare, and I would go back to first principles and say, okay, this is what we're taught as medical students. You rule out the common things. So what killed a 41-year-old woman who's previously been healthy after some months of ill health? And I think some form of cancer, really. If she said my face is black and blue and all wrong colours, that puts a whole different perspective. You know, you think, oh, bruising or anemia or whatever. So more than that, I can't say. I think, you know, common things commonly occur, and I would be going for cancer. And the frustrating thing for all of us who are Jane Austen is we will never know. And, you know, nowadays, as you said at the beginning, a few straightforward blood tests and a scan or two, we'd have the answer and possibly the treatment. So, so the short answer is I don't know, but that's a slightly longer answer.
Right. Well, oh, we've got another one here. Could we cheekily infer that Mrs. Bennet might have colluded with the apothecary who tended Jane after her walk through the rainstorm?
That's a thought. There's no proof of that in the text, but you would put nothing past Mrs. Bennet, would you? The woman,
absolutely nothing. Quite right. Right. Any more questions? Wave your hand. Joan, Sabine, have you got any questions? If not, I've got one here. You showed a very nice slide of the Scottish College of Medicine with two figures either side. And I wondered who the two figures were.
I'm afraid I can't answer that. They're up in a plinth, so I should know. I'm not a member of the College of Physicians, remember, I'm an anaesthetist. So although I've been in the building, I'm afraid I don't know who the two figures are. I'm very sorry.
Oh, never mind.
Somebody can Google it and tell.
Yes, I probably could, actually. I never think of doing that. Oh, right. Now we've got, Robert's got a question.
It's just a comment on Hilary's diagnosis. I'm a fellow doctor. We're always taught that common things are common. And I think a malignancy is the likely diagnosis, probably with some sort of bone marrow effect like thrombocytopenia, accounting for the, I would guess, bruising that she had.
Mm-hmm. That's what I think. I think it's bruising. The black and white.
I agree, yeah. Thrombocytopenia. Yeah.
Right, so Parley, what is your question?
You're muted, Parley.
You're muted. Unmute yourself.
Sorry. I'm the one who had asked about the retrospective view of what could have been wrong with
Jane. Right, okay.
But my question really is, because if you look at some pictures of her, she's shown her face looks terribly ill. I mean, you know, it's all blotchy. So has there been any sort of speculation about what caused that kind of blotchiness?
But the only, there's only two kind of, if you like, validated images of Jane Austen, and one is the little sketch by her sister Cassandra that I showed at the beginning of and the other one, she's actually got her back to the artist, I think also by Cassandra. So all the other ones are sort of derived from the originals, and I think I'm right in saying there's no blotchiness visible in the one which is just a little sketch that Cassandra has dashed off. So yes, she does say my face is black and white and all wrong colours. That's what she says, doesn't she? Which makes it sound as if it's coming and going, doesn't it, rather than a permanent thing.
I've got a comment here from Joan Reynolds, who's Jasna. So I think that's Jane Austen in North America. So that's nice that she's locked in. And she said, no questions, but I do want to say how much I enjoyed this presentation. So detailed and informative. I learned lots of new facts. Thank you.
Thank you, Joan. It's nice to hear. Question there from Marion about Lady Bertram.
Somebody waved. Did Marion wave? I thought I saw somebody wave. No? Well, I've got another question. Why was Scotland, because you always think of Edinburgh as being the medical school for students wherever they were, why was Scotland so far in advance?
I think I can't answer that. I went to Glasgow University, so I would take issue with this Edinburgh University business. It just got there first. I don't know, to be honest. I think Scotland being a smaller country, and nobody was very far from one of the cities, Glasgow, Edinburgh, Aberdeen, I think was the next one. So they had access to the hospital. So it might be that. So I don't actually know the answer to that. I don't know if we've got any proper medical historians in the audience that might know the answer. I'm an amateur medical historian.
Well, if anybody does know, do let us know. And
I have a comment on this because I'm from India.
Just a minute, Dipali. I've got a question here from Celia. Would an apothecary in the 1820s call himself doctor?
In general, no. They would be Mr, but they could call themselves anything they flippin' well liked because there was no regulation. But normally they would be addressed as Mr. Properly they would be Mr because they didn't have a doctorate.
Right. Okay. Right. And Marion's got a question.
Yeah. Thank you for a fascinating talk. Could you say a little bit more about, our favourite character, Lady Bertram? I read an opinion somewhere, I can't remember who said it, and they thought that Mrs. Norris was actually slowly poisoning her so that Mrs. Norris herself could marry in due course Sir Bertram.
I think Sir Bertram, Thomas Bertram and Mrs. Norris would be a bit of a mismatch, frankly. I think Lady Bertram is a genius. If you actually read Mansfield Park and just read what's happening with Lady Bertram, the whole world revolves around Lady Bertram. Everything has to be a bit like Mr. Woodhouse in Emma. Everything has to be arranged to make sure Lady Bertram's taken care of. I wonder if she could either be, she could be hypothyroid. I always think of her as being slightly chubby. Does everyone else think Lady Bertram being a solid citizen? Or possibly some sort of depression, nervous disorder. But
it does seem odd that, nobody is ever called to see her, given that, in the other novels, the medical men do appear.
Yes, I think she just is the way she is. She's maybe, even now, hypothyroidism is a very insidious disease, and it can take a while for people to think, oh, actually, something's actually wrong here, rather than it's just somebody slowing down a bit. So possibly.
Can I ask a follow-up again about one of our favourite characters? I always think it's such a shame that Mrs. Bennet and her nerves don't get the attention of a medical man to see what he might have suggested for Mrs. Bennet's nerves.
I think
feature largely in the novel.
I think psychiatry, I haven't touched on psychiatry at all, and I haven't actually researched it. It was kind of in its infancy and pretty barbaric. So I think we're better off with Mrs. Bertram having the vapours upstairs, when it's all going badly wrong, rather than shut away in an asylum. They didn't have any treatments they could offer her, I suppose. I don't know if things like valerian, the herbal remedies were known to be helpful in that sort of, in anxiety conditions. But yes, Mrs. Bertram and her, Mrs. Bennet and her nerves. She's another genius, isn't she, Mrs.
Yeah, but presumably it was something that was a fairly common thing for Jane Austen to have put that in about Mrs. Bennet. Either she knew women like that, or it was a well-known condition. Yeah.
You do always feel about some of Jane Austen's characters, she knew somebody just like that.
Yeah.
But, her mother, she kind of lived in her nerves a little bit.
Yeah, a bit of a valetudinarian, I think. It's amazing how she managed to live to be well into her 80s. And there was always something wrong with her.
I do think one of the terrible things about Jane Austen's family is they all lived forever, apart from the genius who died at 41,
Right, anybody? Yes, Robert's got another question.
Yeah, two slight points, partly because I'm a psychiatrist. Firstly, don't worry, there weren't any asylums in those days. They were in fact sent to madhouses, and the asylums were developed to prevent the wrongdoings of the madhouses. The second point is that hypochondriacs last longest, not because of any great psychiatric theory that I have, but because my mother always told me that creaking gates last longest.
Yes, yes, indeed. I've heard that. Yeah, absolutely. It's amazing. Quite true. Dipali, yeah?
I was just going to make a comment, really, coming back to the original question. I think you asked about the connection between, medicine and Scotland. And
yes, I did.
The reflection that I would like to make is that, being from India, I'm aware that a lot of people from Scotland came over. There were lots of Scottish people who were actually looking into things like smallpox, for instance. Mm-hmm. And Jenna, he's Scottish, isn't he?
No, Jenna's from... somebody remind me where he's from. Is he not from Oswestry or somewhere over that way, Worcestershire direction?
Oh, sorry. Yeah, but I think the Scots are sort of very into they were into exploring areas like the mountains. They were into the Himalayas in a big way. They explored the mountains of the southern Deccan, and they looked into medicines. I think it's something in their brain, the way they think about things. That's what makes them made them pioneers in medicine.
In Scotland, around that time, we had the Scottish Enlightenment, when, scientific inquiry, education, all these things were valued. So it may be a part of that, really, a reflection. Somebody's just said, Jenna's from Gloucestershire. Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, I don't know if there are any more questions, but that was really, really interesting, Hilary. Really good, thoroughly enjoyable. You'll have to come back and give us another one sometime in the future. So if there are... Oh, wait a minute.
Joan's waving.
Are you waving or saying goodbye, Joan?
Well, I did put a quick question in there, and it may be too long for the time left, but...
No, go on, you've got time.
Okay. Anyway, I'll say it out loud then. Could you comment on the use of a physician for childbirth versus a midwife and the proliferation of puerperal fever after childbirth, which killed so many of, well, even in the Austen family? Because I think back to Scottish doctors in later times that were so vigilant about washing hands when you went from autopsies to the maternity ward. And that was such a long time before that simple procedure of washing hands, which is so topical today. And these home births, where the richer families had the physician come in. The village mother would have had the midwife or even a relative help her. So,
yes.
I'm sorry, it's a long, roundy question, but if you know what I mean.
Well, you're actually right. Semmelweis was an Austrian, I think, obstetrician he got pelters, as we say in Scotland. He was heavily criticised for having the temerity to suggest that people might like to wash their hands between patients. And I think you're right. I think the doctors, there were surgeons, in fact, the man midwives, they would go from patient to patient, whereas the midwife would tend to be with you for a number of hours. So the doctor might be called in if there was a problem, and he might just have been somewhere else, or kind of cleaning out his horse's stable or whatever. So I think you're right. I think traditionally, the midwives, the female midwives, spread it around a bit less. It was the doctors that really did the spreading about.
I've got a comment here. Nancy, wonderful talk. Thank you so much. Somebody else, Brisley, here, absolutely fascinating and wonderfully delivered. And we've got Kirk from Boston. Hello, Kirk.
Kirk
says, have you read The Mysterious Death of Miss Austen? Has anybody read The Mysterious Death of Miss Austen? No, I haven't. And again, we've got Brisley reminding us that you are welcome to peruse all our upcoming talks and events at brisley.org. And don't forget that everything that we've had as a talk for the last year will be on Brisley's YouTube. So if you want to hear Hilary's talk again, you've only got to wait a few weeks before it'll be up again. And so you can go through it all again.
You can watch me faffing about trying to make my slides work at the beginning.
Well, it has been a really good evening. We've had so many people from around the world. It's been lovely to have people from America and Wales and all sorts. And once again, thank you very, very much, Hilary. It's been so enjoyable. And if we've got no more questions, if no more comments, I'm going to say thank you and good night.
Bye.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm going for a gin and tonic now. I don't know about the rest.
Bye-bye, everybody. Thank you for joining. Don't forget our next talk is September the 25th.
Oh, right.